My wife of 40 years died and left me exactly one item. It was a black smartphone locked with a complex alphanumeric password. As I sat in the cold leather chair of her estate lawyer's office, my own son openly laughed at me while he and his wife inherited a $30 million logistics empire, a sprawling estate, and a fleet of luxury cars. Humiliated, discarded, and suddenly homeless. I spent my nights in a cramped room trying every combination I could think of to unlock that glowing screen. Then exactly at midnight on my 70th birthday, the screen woke up on its own. It unlocked without me touching it. It rang. And the voice on the other end said something that made the phone slip right out of my trembling hand. Before I reveal the terrifying secret my wife took to her grave, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always digs its own grave, and that the truth always finds a way into the light, no matter how deep the betrayal goes. I am Douglas, 70 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I believed I had a family. The reality of my situation hit me not at Caroline's funeral, but in the mahogany-paneled office of her estate attorney 3 days later. The air in the room was stifling, smelling of expensive cologne and old paper. I sat on one side of the massive glass table, my hands folded in my lap, still wearing the black suit from the burial. Across from me sat my son Cameron and his wife Valerie. They were not wearing black. Cameron was in a sharp navy-tailored suit, repeatedly checking his expensive watch, while Valerie tapped away furiously on her phone, her designer handbag resting on the table as if it deserved its own seat. The lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He did not offer condolences. He simply opened the thick leather folder and began reading Caroline's final addendum, dated just 2 weeks before her heart finally gave out. I listened in stunned silence as the legacy we had built together was dismantled and handed away. Cameron was awarded the absolute controlling shares of Montgomery Logistics, the company Caroline and I had started in our garage 30 years ago. It was currently valued at just over $30 million. Cameron leaned back in his chair, a slow, satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He didn't look at me. He looked at the ceiling, as if calculating his new net worth in real time. Then came Valerie's turn. The lawyer announced that the deeds to the primary estate, our home of 25 years, along with the entire fleet of company-leased vehicles, were transferred directly to her name. Valerie did not even look up from her phone. She simply smiled, typed another message, and whispered to Cameron that she was finally going to gut the master bathroom and get rid of those awful vintage tiles. I sat there, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I waited for my name. I waited for the mention of the joint accounts, the retirement fund, or even the small lake cabin where Caroline and I had spent our anniversaries. The lawyer reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, sealed manila envelope. He slid it across the glass table toward me. It stopped inches from my hands. To my husband Douglas, the lawyer read, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. I leave my secondary personal cellular device. I stared at the envelope. I looked at the lawyer, expecting him to turn the page to continue reading, but he simply closed the leather folder and folded his hands. That was it. That was the entirety of my inheritance. Cameron let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. He actually laughed. He slapped his hand on the table, shaking his head. A phone, he chuckled, looking at Valerie. She left him a burner phone. Well, Dad, at least you can use it to call an Uber. I ignored him. My hands were shaking slightly as I tore open the flap of the envelope. Inside was a sleek black smartphone. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated, displaying a stark white background and a prompt for a passcode. There was no background image, no apps, just a blinking cursor demanding a sequence of numbers and letters I did not know. I looked up at the lawyer. What is the passcode? I asked, my voice tight. The lawyer shook his head. There is no passcode on file, Douglas. Caroline was very specific. She handed me the device in a sealed state and instructed me to pass it to you exactly as it is. Valerie finally put her phone down. Well, if we are finished here, she said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. I have a meeting with the real estate agent in an hour. We have contractors coming to the house tomorrow morning to start the renovations. So Douglas, you should probably head back and start packing. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice rising just a fraction. That is my home. Caroline and I bought that land together. Cameron stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Not anymore, Dad. You heard the will. The deed is in Valerie's name now. I looked between the two of them, the sheer audacity of their greed suffocating me. 5 years ago, when Caroline was first diagnosed, I didn't hesitate. I stepped completely away from the corporate world. I resigned from the board of Montgomery Logistics, handing the daily operations over to Cameron so I could be my wife's full-time caregiver. I spent the last 5 years of my life measuring out medications, driving to endless oncology appointments, and sitting awake at night listening to her breathe. I trusted my son to maintain the business we built. I trusted him to protect our legacy, and now he was standing in front of me, a multimillionaire, telling me to pack my bags. I drove back to the estate in a state of absolute numbness. The drive up the winding, tree-lined driveway felt like approaching a stranger's house. When I walked through the front double doors, the reality of my nightmare hit me. There were already movers in the foyer. Strange men in gray uniforms were aggressively wrapping my antique reading chair in plastic. Stacked against the grand staircase were dozens of cheap, flimsy cardboard boxes. Valerie had wasted absolutely no time. I walked into the living room. Cameron was standing by the fireplace drinking a glass of scotch from my private collection. He turned as I entered, reaching into the breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and a sleek white envelope, walking over to me with an air of profound arrogance. He held out the envelope. I had the accounting department draft this up for you, he said casually. It's a check for $5,000. Consider it severance, a little something to help you get on your feet. Get a nice apartment in the suburbs. Now I'm going to need your keys to the house and the gates. I looked at the envelope, then up at my son. I did not raise my hand to take it. I am not taking your severance, Cameron, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. This house was purchased during our marriage. Regardless of whatever addendum you forced your mother to sign legally, half of this estate belongs to me. You cannot evict me from my own property. Cameron sighed, a dramatic, exaggerated sound of exhaustion, as if dealing with me was a massive inconvenience. He unfolded the piece of paper he was holding and held it up to my face. You really don't remember, do you? He asked, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. I stared at the document. It was a durable power of attorney. It gave complete and total control of all marital assets, real estate, and financial accounts to Caroline. And at the bottom, right next to the notary stamp, was my signature. My mind raced backward, tearing through the chaotic blur of the last few months. I remembered the terrible week in December. Caroline had taken a sharp turn for the worse. The hospice nurses were running in and out of the house. Alarms were going off. I hadn't slept in 3 days. Cameron had come into the bedroom crying, shoving a stack of medical release forms and hospital liability waivers into my hands, telling me the doctors needed my signature immediately to administer the emergency morphine. I had signed everything he put in front of me, without reading a single word, my eyes entirely fixed on my dying wife. He had slipped the power of attorney into that stack of medical papers. He had used my panic, my grief, and my love for his mother to steal my life. Once you signed everything over to Mom, Cameron explained, taking a slow sip of his scotch. She had the legal right to transfer the deed entirely into her name. And once it was in her name, she could leave it to whoever she wanted. Which, as you just heard, is my wife. He smiled, a cold, empty expression that made him look like a total stranger. You have until 6 p.m. to get your boxes out of the hallway, Dad. After that, I'm having the security codes changed. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a punch. I realized in that exact moment that the son I had raised was completely gone, replaced by a parasite wearing his face. I turned around, in silence walked past the movers, and began putting my clothes into the cheap cardboard boxes. By nightfall, I was sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress, in a cramped, noisy apartment on the edge of the city. The rent was cheap, the walls were paper-thin, and the smell of stale cooking oil seeped through the floorboards. I unpacked nothing. I just sat at the small, rickety kitchen table under a flickering fluorescent bulb, staring at the black smartphone resting on the laminate surface. I picked it up. The screen glowed to life. The passcode prompt stared back at me. I tried Caroline's birthday. Incorrect. I tried our anniversary. Incorrect. I tried Cameron's birthday, the date we founded the company, the address of our first house. Incorrect, incorrect, incorrect. But then I noticed something. Hidden in the bottom right corner of the lock screen, rendered in a very faint gray font, was a string of numbers. It wasn't the time. It was a countdown timer. And it was moving. Hours, minutes, seconds, ticking down relentlessly. I did the math in my head. The timer was set to hit 0 in exactly 14 days. On the midnight of my 70th birthday, I set the phone down, a knot of deep unease forming in my stomach. What was she waiting for? Why the delay? The next morning, the reality of my survival took precedence over the mystery of the phone. I needed food. I walked 2 blocks to a discount grocery store, filling a small plastic basket with bread, eggs, and coffee. I stood at the checkout line, counting the few dollar bills in my wallet, and then pulled out the debit card linked to the joint emergency savings account I shared with Caroline. It was an account I had meticulously funded for years, separate from the business, containing just over $80,000. It was supposed to be our safety net. I swiped the card. The terminal beeped loudly. A red message flashed on the screen, declined. I frowned, wiping the magnetic strip on my shirt and trying again. Declined. The cashier, a young girl chewing gum, sighed loudly. "You got another card, mister?" she asked as the line of people behind me began to grumble. I left the groceries on the counter and walked out of the store, my face burning with humiliation. I stood on the sidewalk as cars rushed by, pulling out my own cell phone and calling the bank's customer service line. After 20 minutes on hold, a representative finally answered. "I need to know why my card is being declined," I said, reading off my account number. There was a long pause followed by the sound of rapid typing. "Sir, I am looking at your account now," the representative said, her tone shifting to one of practiced corporate detachment. "This account has been frozen." "Frozen," I echoed, my voice cracking. "On what authority my name is on that account?" "Yes, sir, but the primary account holder was listed as Caroline Montgomery. We received legal instruction this morning from the executor of her estate to freeze all liquid assets pending a comprehensive financial audit." "Who gave the instruction?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. "The executor on file, sir, Cameron Montgomery. He hadn't just taken the house and the company. He was suffocating me. He was cutting off my air supply, making sure I didn't have the resources to hire a lawyer or fight back. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me crawling back to him, begging for that $5,000 severance check." I hung up the phone and looked down the dirty street of my new neighborhood. I had $32 in my pocket. I had a box of clothes, and I had a locked phone with a timer ticking down to my 70th birthday. I walked back to my apartment, locked the door, and sat back down at the table. I didn't cry. The time for grief had passed. As I watched the seconds tick away on the black screen, a new cold resolve began to settle over me. Cameron thought I was weak because I had spent the last 5 years being gentle. He had forgotten that before I was a caregiver, I was the man who built an empire from nothing. He wanted a war of attrition. I stared at the countdown timer. 14 days. I didn't know what was going to happen when that timer hit 0, but I knew one thing for certain. I was going to survive until it did. And when I finally found out what my wife had left me, I was going to use it to burn his stolen kingdom to the ground. 2 weeks had passed since I was thrown out of my own home. The countdown on the locked phone sitting on my cheap nightstand was steadily approaching 0. But tonight, that timer was not the only thing occupying my mind. Tonight was the annual Montgomery Logistics Winter Gala. My late wife Caroline and I had started this charity event 28 years ago. We began it in a rented high school gymnasium to raise emergency funds for the families of our truck drivers who had been severely injured on the icy winter roads. We had cooked and served the food ourselves during that first year. We knew every driver by name. Over the decades, as our company grew into a $30 million empire, the gala grew with it. It became the most prestigious corporate event in the city, held at the magnificent Grand Plaza Hotel, raising millions for various regional causes. I stood across the street in the freezing rain, pulling the collar of my old wool coat tight against my neck. Underneath the coat, I wore a charcoal suit I had not put on in almost 10 years. It was incredibly loose around my shoulders, now a physical reminder of the weight I had lost during the terrible sleepless months of Carolyn's final battle with illness. I watched the endless line of black limousines pull up to the valet stand under the hotel awning. Women in glittering designer gowns and men in custom-tailored tuxedos stepped out onto the plush red carpet, laughing loudly and holding delicate glasses of champagne handed to them by the hotel staff. I crossed the wet street, dodging a deep puddle of icy water, feeling like an absolute ghost, returning to a world that had already buried me and moved on. I walked up the sweeping marble steps toward the main entrance, heading instinctively for the velvet rope that marked the VIP lane. A tall young man wearing a headset and holding a heavy clipboard stood guarding the entrance. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering judgmentally on the frayed cuffs of my old coat and the scuff marks on my shoes. He politely but firmly informed me that this specific line was reserved strictly for invited corporate guests and board members only. I offered him a tight, patient smile and told him gently that I knew the rules. I stated my name, Douglas Montgomery, and explained that I was the founder of the event. The young man frowned slightly, tapping his expensive pen against the edge of his clipboard. He flipped through 3 pages of brightly highlighted names. He flipped back to the first page and checked the entire list again. He looked up at me with a mixture of deep suspicion and uncomfortable pity. He apologized and told me that my name was nowhere on the VIP guest list. I felt a sudden flush of heat rise in my cheeks, despite the bitter cold wind whipping around us. I insisted there must be some sort of clerical mistake. I told him my wife and I created this entire foundation from nothing, and I asked him to check under Carolyn Montgomery, thinking perhaps my invitation was still listed under her name. The man shook his head slowly. He explained that the entire executive guest list had been personally updated that very morning by the new chief executive officer. He said he had strict, non-negotiable instructions regarding the VIP section, and if I was not on his printed list, he absolutely could not let me through the main entrance. I stood there frozen in disbelief as a wealthy couple pushed past me, handing their expensive coats to the attendant and vanishing into the warmth and golden light of the luxury lobby. I recognized the man pushing past me. He was a regional director I had personally hired and trained 15 years ago. He did not even glance in my direction. The security man cleared his throat and pointed toward a dark side door down the street. He told me I could purchase a general admission ticket at the public box office around the corner if I still wished to attend. I slowly backed away from the velvet rope. The humiliation burned in my chest, feeling hot and incredibly sharp. My own son had maliciously erased me from the guest list of the very charity my wife had spent half her life building. I walked around the side of the massive hotel building, the freezing wind biting mercilessly at my face and hands. The general admission line was terribly long, filled mostly with junior warehouse employees and local equipment vendors. I stood shivering at the very back of the line, waiting for nearly 45 minutes before I finally reached the small ticket window. The tired woman behind the thick glass tapped continuously on her keyboard and told me the entry fee was $150. I opened my thin, worn leather wallet. I had exactly $160 left to my name. It was the absolute remainder of the cash I had scraped together after walking into a pawn shop earlier that week and selling the gold retirement watch Caroline had given me a decade ago. I slid the wrinkled, damp bills under the glass partition. The woman handed me a cheap, bright yellow paper wristband. I wrapped it around my wrist, feeling the scratchy paper rubbing against my skin. It felt like a degrading brand. It felt like a loud, neon declaration of my absolute financial defeat. But I refused to turn around and walk back to my miserable apartment. I needed to see exactly what Cameron was doing to Caroline's legacy. I needed to witness the true extent of his moral rot with my own eyes. I walked through the heavy side doors and entered the grand ballroom. The sheer scale of the financial extravagance made my stomach churn with disgust. Caroline and I had always fiercely insisted that the winter gala remain elegant, but strictly focused on the charity itself. Every single dollar spent on lavish decorations was a dollar taken directly away from the grieving families who desperately needed it to pay their mortgages and medical bills. But tonight, the ballroom had been completely transformed into a vulgar temple of excess. Massive, intricate ice sculptures shaped like delivery trucks stood melting slowly at the four corners of the room. A 12-piece classical orchestra played modern pop songs on a raised platform surrounded by thousands of imported, out-of-season white roses. Dozens of waiters carried heavy silver trays piled high with expensive caviar and imported truffles. This was not a charity event anymore to help the working class. This was a royal coronation for my son. I stood quietly near the back of the massive room, hovering near the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, nursing a single glass of tap water. I watched the powerful people I used to call my peers and friends. I saw wealthy bank executives I had played golf with on Sunday mornings. I saw local politicians I had donated thousands of dollars to over the years. I saw supply chain directors I had personally mentored when they were just kids out of college. A few of them accidentally made eye contact with me across the crowded room. I saw the immediate flash of recognition in their eyes, followed instantly by the uncomfortable, guilty shift of their shoulders as they turned their backs to me, pretending they had not seen me standing there. They all knew I had been ousted from the company. In their ruthless corporate world, current power was the only currency that actually mattered, and Cameron held the entire checkbook now. To them, I was just a ghost haunting the edges of the room in a baggy, outdated suit. The orchestra suddenly stopped playing, cutting off the music mid-measure. A hushed silence fell over the 500 guests as the main chandeliers dimmed. A single brilliant white spotlight hit the center of the massive main stage. Cameron walked out from behind the heavy velvet curtain, looking exactly like a movie star in a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. The crowd immediately erupted into thunderous applause. He smiled broadly, waving his hands with practiced humility to quiet them down, clearly soaking in the sheer adoration of the room. He welcomed everyone to the gala, his voice echoing perfectly through the state-of-the-art sound system. His voice was incredibly smooth, deeply practiced, and entirely devoid of any genuine human emotion. He told the crowd that this had been a year of tremendous, painful transition for the company. He mentioned that his mother had recently passed away, pausing strategically to let a murmur of sympathetic sounds ripple through the wealthy crowd. Cameron bowed his head in a perfect, calculated imitation of a grieving son. But he quickly raised his head, his voice rising with theatrical passion. He claimed she had left him with a profound and heavy responsibility. He said she had tasked him with taking the company into the modern future. And to do that, he announced boldly, the company had to shed the outdated, inefficient practices of the past. "We must evolve," he declared. I gripped my water glass so tightly, I honestly thought the thick glass might shatter in my hand and cut me. Outdated practices. He was talking about the strict driver safety regulations and the generous employee healthcare benefit programs Caroline and I had bled and fought to implement. Effective tomorrow morning, Cameron announced loudly, pacing aggressively across the stage. The company will officially be rebranded as Apex Global Transport. A massive digital screen behind him suddenly flashed to life, displaying a sleek, cold, and aggressive new corporate logo. The Montgomery name, my family name, my dead wife's legacy vanished from the screen in a fraction of a second, completely erased and replaced by something soulless and corporate. But a new corporate identity is not enough, Cameron said into the microphone, pausing again for dramatic effect. He told the silent crowd that the company needed a new beating heart for its philanthropic efforts. The old ways of handing out small charity checks to local workers were completely over. He announced they were launching a massive global initiative. And to lead this shiny new era of corporate charity, he wanted to introduce the new head of philanthropy, describing her as a woman whose vision and deep compassion were entirely unmatched in the industry. He asked the crowd to welcome his beautiful wife, Valerie. The applause was absolutely deafening as Valerie gracefully walked onto the stage. She wore a stunning diamond-encrusted silver gown that undoubtedly cost more than the yearly rent of my miserable new apartment. She smiled radiantly, waving gracefully to the crowd, her hand resting delicately on Cameron's arm as they posed together for the professional photographers. This was the exact same woman who had coldly ordered movers to throw my personal belongings into cheap cardboard boxes while my wife was barely cold in the ground. Now she was standing in front of 500 powerful people, happily accepting their loud applause as a pure champion of human charity and kindness. Cameron held up a hand to quiet the cheering crowd once more. He leaned into the microphone and said that before they opened the dance floor and served dinner, he wanted to take a very brief moment to acknowledge the past. His eyes began to scan the massive darkened room. He was actively looking for me. He knew I was there in the building. The security guard with the clipboard at the front door must have radioed him the moment I bought my general admission ticket. Cameron's eyes finally locked directly onto me, standing completely alone in the shadows near the kitchen doors. He smiled warmly and said he wanted to personally thank his retired father, Douglas. His voice dripped with a heavy, condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. He pointed his finger directly at the back of the room. Suddenly, a bright, blinding mechanical spotlight swung aggressively across the high ceiling, cutting through the darkness and illuminating me perfectly against the dark wood paneling of the back wall. 500 heads turned simultaneously in their chairs to look at me. I stood absolutely frozen in the harsh, glaring beam of light. Cameron's voice echoed all around me, thanking me for my past efforts in building the humble foundation of what he and Valerie had now perfected. He smiled into the camera and told me to enjoy my quiet retirement, adding that they would take it from here. The massive ballroom was dead silent. Absolutely no one clapped. No one smiled or cheered for the founder. They just sat in the dark and stared at me. The collective pity in their eyes was an actual physical weight pressing down heavily on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I saw the cruel whispers starting at the tables closest to me. I saw women covering their mouths with their manicured hands as they murmured to their husbands, looking critically at my cheap yellow paper wristband and my oversized, terribly out-of-fashion suit. Cameron stood on the brightly lit stage, a smug, deeply triumphant grin plastered completely across his face. He wanted me to break down. He wanted me to drop my head in profound shame, to turn around in tears and run out of the building like a beaten dog. He wanted to demonstrate to every single powerful person in that room that I was utterly powerless, a sad relic of the past, who had been entirely conquered and discarded by the new king. I did not lower my head. I stood absolutely still, keeping my breathing slow and steady under the hot glare of the spotlight. I looked past the wealthy crowd, past the melting ice sculptures, and locked my eyes directly onto my son on the stage. I let him see the absolute terrifying stillness in my face. I let him see that I was not a broken man. The public humiliation was very real. The familial betrayal was profound. But beneath all of that pain, a cold, highly calculated clarity was finally taking permanent shape in my mind. Cameron honestly believed he had won the war just because he had stolen the castle. He was too arrogant to realize that a castle built on stolen ground is nothing more than a giant trap waiting to be sprung. The harsh spotlight finally shifted away from me, moving back to the center stage as the orchestra quickly struck up a lively, upbeat waltz to break the tension. The crowd immediately turned their backs to me, eager to forget the incredibly awkward moment and return to their expensive champagne and conversations. I set my glass of water down quietly on a nearby waiter's tray. I did not need to see anything else tonight. I had witnessed the absolute full extent of his blinding arrogance. I turned around silently and walked out the heavy side doors, stepping back into the freezing winter rain. I did not take the city bus home that night. I walked the entire 2 miles in the freezing cold, feeling the icy puddle water seep deep into my old shoes, intentionally using the physical discomfort to sharpen my mind and fuel my anger. When I finally reached my dark, cramped apartment building, I did not even turn on the overhead lights. I walked straight into the small bedroom and sat heavily on the edge of the sagging mattress. I looked over at the black smartphone resting silently on the nightstand. The faint gray countdown timer on the lock screen was still ticking down, second by second. 10 days left. Exactly 10 days until I turned 70 years old. 10 days until my wife's final silent secret was revealed to me. I took off my wet, heavy coat and lay back on the bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling in the dark. Cameron had just shown me exactly how much he loved a grand public audience. He loved the stage. He loved the bright spotlight and the applause. And as I slowly drifted off to sleep to the rhythm of the rain hitting my window, I promised myself one absolute truth. When the right time finally came, I was going to give my arrogant son the biggest audience he had ever had in his entire life, and I was going to force every single one of them to watch as he lost absolutely everything. I did not wait for the sun to rise completely the next morning. I put on the same damp, heavy wool coat from the night before and took the early city bus downtown. I stepped off the bus right in front of the towering glass and steel headquarters of the company I had built with my own 2 hands from absolute scratch. The massive metallic letters that used to spell our family name above the revolving front doors had already been torn down overnight. The name Montgomery was completely gone, leaving only faint ghostly outlines on the stone facade. In its place hung a massive temporary banner reading Apex Global Transport. I walked through the heavy glass doors and into the sprawling marble lobby. The security guards standing at the front desk were all brand new hires. They did not recognize the tired old man standing near the private executive elevator. They paid absolutely no attention to me as I waited quietly in the corner, watching the morning rush of employees flood into the building. At exactly 8 in the morning, Cameron walked through the revolving doors. He was wearing a sharp, tailored gray suit and holding a cup of artisan coffee. He was flanked by 2 young junior executives who were laughing nervously at whatever he was saying, hanging onto his every word like desperate dogs. He looked entirely rested and arrogant, carrying the triumphant energy of a man who believed he had just conquered the entire world at the gala the night before. I stepped out of the shadows and moved directly into his path. I forced him to stop so abruptly that the dark coffee sloshed over the rim of his cup and spilled directly onto his expensive leather shoes. He looked up with a flash of genuine anger, but his expression quickly morphed into a tight, patronizing smile when he realized it was me. He snapped his fingers and told his 2 young executives to give him a minute alone. He stepped much closer to me, lowering his voice so the passing employees could not hear him. He asked me what on earth I was doing here, reminding me coldly that the building security team had strict and explicit orders to immediately arrest me for trespassing if I ever showed my face on the property again. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I did not care about the building or his newly hired security guards. I kept my voice incredibly low and steady. I told him I wanted my executive retirement pension. I carefully explained that while he might have manipulated his dying mother into signing away the estate and the corporate shares, my executive pension was a completely separate legal entity. I had personally paid into that specific fund for 30 solid years. It was my money legally protected and entirely separate from the company operating budget. I demanded that he contact the financial department and unfreeze my access to it immediately so I could secure a safe place to live. Cameron took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, looking around the busy marble lobby to ensure no one was listening to our conversation. He stepped right into my personal space, his expensive designer cologne making my empty stomach turn. He shook his head slowly and told me I really had absolutely no idea how modern corporate finance worked anymore. He chuckled, a dry and incredibly harsh sound that echoed slightly in the large space. He looked down at me and stated plainly that there was no pension money left for me to access. I felt a sudden cold knot form deep in my stomach. I asked him exactly what he meant by that. He leaned in so close I could feel his breath on my face and whispered that the lavish party last night and the massive rebranding campaign were not just for show to impress the local politicians. He revealed that he was currently in the final stages of acquiring our absolute biggest regional competitor. It was a hostile corporate buyout worth over $40 million. My mind raced, trying to do the math. I knew the company ledgers by heart. I told him the company did not have anywhere near that kind of liquid capital available to purchase a massive competitor. He smiled an empty and terrifying expression. He told me he had leveraged the entire employee pension fund as direct collateral to secure a massive bridge loan from an international banking syndicate. Every single dollar of the retirement accounts, including my own personal executive pension, was currently locked entirely in corporate escrow. He explained smugly that if the massive acquisition went through, the company would double in size overnight, and he would be a legend in the industry. But right now, the money was legally untouchable by anyone. I felt a sudden violent surge of pure, unadulterated rage. My hands actually shook as I grabbed the lapel of his expensive gray suit. I told him that what he had just done was completely illegal. Using protected employee retirement funds to secure a high-risk corporate loan was federal wire fraud and a massive violation of labor laws. I told him I would walk straight out of this lobby and go directly to the Federal Labor Board and the banking authorities before lunch to report the embezzlement. Cameron did not flinch. He did not look scared or intimidated in the slightest. He looked entirely victorious. He reached up and slowly peeled my trembling hand off his suit jacket. He nodded slowly and told me to go right ahead and call the federal authorities. But he warned me to think very carefully about the immediate consequences of that phone call. He explained in a cold, calculated whisper that if I blew the whistle, the federal government would instantly freeze all company assets pending a massive investigation. The pending acquisition would immediately fail. The massive international loans would instantly default by the end of the week. The company would be forced directly into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. He patted me hard on the shoulder, letting his words sink in. He reminded me that over 800 local employees, the very same working-class families Caroline and I had sworn to protect and provide for, would lose their jobs, their health care, and their own pensions permanently. If I sued him, I would not just be destroying him. I would be incinerating my dead wife's entire lifelong legacy and ruining the lives of hundreds of completely innocent people. He stepped back from me, his eyes completely dead of any warmth or familial connection. He told me to go back to my cheap apartment, to collect my tiny government Social Security checks, and to stay completely out of his way forever. He made it absolutely clear that if I made a single move against him, the total destruction of this company and all its people would be entirely on my hands. He turned his back on me without another word and walked onto the private executive elevator. The polished steel doors slid shut perfectly, reflecting my own pale, exhausted face. I stood completely alone in the bustling lobby, paralyzed by the brilliant cruelty of his trap. I walked out of the building and back into the freezing city streets, realizing I had absolutely no legal moves left to make. The countdown timer on my locked phone was now the only hope I had left in the entire world. I walked back to the bus stop in a complete daze. The freezing winter wind whipped through the thin fabric of my coat, but I barely felt the cold. My mind was entirely consumed by the invisible prison my son had just built around me. Cameron had not just stolen my money and my home. He had taken 800 innocent families hostage. If I went to the federal banking authorities to save myself, I would be directly triggering a massive investigation. The corporate accounts would be frozen, and the company would collapse into bankruptcy within weeks. I would be destroying the lives of the warehouse workers, the mechanics, and the truck drivers who had trusted me for decades. I remembered their faces clearly. I remembered sitting with them in the noisy break room, pouring hot coffee and asking about their children. Cameron knew my heart better than anyone. He knew I could never pull the legal trigger if it meant destroying those good people in the process. He had weaponized my own conscience against me, leaving me entirely paralyzed. The bus ride back to the desolate edge of the city took over an hour. Every single bump in the road felt like a physical blow to my exhausted body. I stepped off the bus and walked the final 4 blocks to my building in the dark. The streetlights flickered weakly overhead, casting long, lonely shadows on the cracked pavement. I had never felt so utterly defeated in my entire 70 years of life. I climbed the 3 steep flights of stairs to my apartment, feeling a deep, terrible ache in my knees. I unlocked the thin wooden door and stepped into the small, cold room. I did not even bother to turn on the overhead light. The only illumination came from the sickly orange glow of a street lamp filtering through the dirty window pane. I took off my damp coat and let it drop heavily to the linoleum floor. I sank onto the edge of the sagging mattress and buried my face in my hands. The silence in the small room was absolutely suffocating. I looked over at the small digital clock glowing faintly on the stove in the kitchen area. It was 11:15 in the evening. In exactly 45 minutes, I would officially turn 70 years old. I thought about the massive celebration Caroline had secretly planned for my 60th birthday 10 years ago. She had rented out a beautiful vineyard in the valley. All our friends were there, and we danced under the clear night sky until dawn. Now I was spending my 70th birthday alone in a freezing apartment with $30 to my name, waiting for a dead piece of technology to tell me what to do. The contrast between my past and my present was so sharp and painful that it actually made my chest physically ache. I reached out and picked up the black smartphone from the nightstand. The screen lit up, recognizing the warmth of my touch. The faint gray countdown timer in the bottom corner read 40 minutes and 12 seconds. I stared at the changing numbers, feeling a sudden wave of deep, bitter doubt wash over me. What if this was all for nothing? What if Caroline had not left me a weapon at all? My wife was a brilliant and ruthless businesswoman, but she was also incredibly forgiving when it came to our son. What if she had just left me a pre-recorded video message telling me to make peace with Cameron and move on with my life? What if this phone only contained old family photographs and sentimental letters meant to bring me closure? If that was the case, I was truly finished. I would be entirely homeless by the end of the month. I lay back on the bed, holding the cold phone flat against my chest. The apartment building was completely quiet. The only sound in the night was the distant rumble of a passing freight train and the frantic, heavy beating of my own heart. I watched the green numbers on the stove clock slowly change. 11:30, 11:40, 11:50. The tension in my body grew so intense that my shoulder muscles began to cramp. I sat back up and placed the phone flat on the empty wooden nightstand. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, unblinking. 11:58. I could hear my own breathing echoing loud and shallow in the quiet room. 11:59. I felt a single drop of cold sweat slide down the side of my face. I stared intensely at the black rectangular piece of glass. I prayed silently to a wife who was no longer there, begging her to give me something to fight back with. I needed a sword, not a shield. The green numbers on the stove clock clicked to exactly 12:00. Midnight. My 70th birthday had officially arrived. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The phone remained dark and completely silent. A heavy, crushing wave of absolute despair hit me. I closed my eyes, preparing to accept my miserable fate. But then the dark room was suddenly flooded with a sharp, brilliant blue light. My eyes snapped open. The smartphone on the nightstand had illuminated entirely on its own. The screen did not show the familiar numeric keypad asking for a password. The lock screen was completely gone. The device had magically bypassed its own security protocols. A small green padlock icon appeared in the center of the bright screen, vibrating gently before snapping open with a soft, audible click. And then, the silence of the room was completely shattered. The phone began to ring. It was a loud, piercing, mechanical ringtone that made me jump back on the mattress. A green call accept button flashed aggressively on the bright screen. The caller identification text simply read, "Unknown caller." My hands shook violently as I reached out toward the vibrating device. I took a deep, trembling breath and pressed my finger against the glowing green button. I stared at the flashing green button on the screen as the piercing mechanical ringtone echoed off the bare walls of my cheap apartment. My hands were shaking so violently that I almost dropped the device before I could even answer it. I pressed my thumb against the glass and slowly brought the cold phone to my ear. I did not say a word. I just sat there in the dark, clutching the plastic casing and listening. For the first few seconds, there was absolutely nothing but the faint hum of an open cellular connection. I could hear the sound of someone breathing on the other end, and then the sharp, distinct click of an audio file being played. Then a voice filled the silent room. "Happy birthday, love," she said. The sound hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was Caroline. It was not the fragile, pain-filled whisper I had listened to during her final weeks in the hospice facility. This was the vibrant, commanding voice of the woman I had married 40 years ago. The woman who could silence a boardroom full of angry corporate executives simply by clearing her throat. I closed my eyes as hot, heavy tears instantly flooded my vision. "You finally made it to 70, she continued, her tone incredibly warm, but laced with an undeniable edge of sharp anticipation. "I am so sorry I cannot be there to drink champagne with you tonight. I know the last few weeks have been absolute hell for you. I know exactly what Cameron has done. But I promised I would always protect you, Douglas, and I always keep my promises. Now the real game begins." There was another soft click, and the recording ended abruptly. I sat entirely frozen on the edge of the sagging mattress. My mind was reeling. She had known. Even as she lay dying in our master bedroom, heavily medicated and fading away, she had somehow anticipated every single cruel thing our son was going to do. She knew he would betray me. She had planned this exact moment. I tried to speak, to call out her name into the dark room, but my throat was completely tight with grief and shock. Before I could force a single word out, a new voice came on the line. "Good evening, Douglas," the man said. His voice was deep calm and carried the polished, precise accent of someone who dealt exclusively in high-level corporate warfare. "My name is Philip Carson. I am the senior partner at an elite private forensic accounting firm based out of Zurich. I have been working exclusively and entirely in secret for your late wife for the past 4 years." I wiped the tears from my face with the rough sleeve of my coat. I asked him what he meant. I asked him how he got access to this encrypted phone and what kind of sick game my wife was talking about in that recording. I demanded to know why she would sit back and allow our only son to throw me out onto the street and steal the entire company we had spent 3 decades building together. Philip Carson told me to take a deep breath. He spoke with absolute professional detachment, but there was a hint of deep respect in his voice when he mentioned Caroline. He told me that he understood I was in severe shock, but I needed to listen very carefully because the window of opportunity she had built for us was about to open. He explained that Caroline did not let Cameron steal the company because she was weak or manipulated. She let him steal it because she knew my heart was far too soft to ever punish him the way he truly deserved. She knew I would always try to forgive him and that my constant forgiveness would eventually ruin me. She took the burden of vengeance entirely upon herself, so I would not have to feel the guilt of destroying my own son. Carson asked me to think back to 5 years ago, when I first stepped down from the daily operations to become her full-time caregiver. He told me that almost immediately after I handed the operational reins to Cameron, our son began systematically embezzling from the corporate accounts. He created dozens of phantom vendor contracts. He funneled millions of dollars in operating capital into offshore shell corporations to fund the lavish, extravagant lifestyle he and Valerie were suddenly flaunting. Cameron thought he was a financial genius. He thought his parents were too old and distracted by terminal illness to notice the massive bleeding holes in the ledgers. But Caroline noticed, Carson said. She noticed within the first 6 months. Instead of calling the federal authorities and watching her only son go to federal prison while you were trying to care for her, she called me. She hired my firm to secretly track and document every single stolen dollar. We built a flawless shadow ledger. We gathered irrefutable evidence of every wire fraud, every forged signature, and every illegal bank transfer he ever made. But we never stopped him. Caroline gave me strict orders to let him keep stealing. She wanted him to build his own inescapable prison. I shook my head in the dark, trying to process the sheer scale of the deception. I told Carson that Cameron was currently leveraging the company pension to secure a $40 million bank loan. I told him Cameron was acting like a king, parading around grand ballrooms and firing loyal employees. Carson let out a short, dry chuckle that held absolutely no humor. He is acting like a king because he has absolutely no idea he is sitting on a throne made of pure dynamite, Carson said, his voice dropping to a serious, calculated whisper. Douglas, you need to understand the absolute brilliance of your wife. The company your son inherited, the empire he was parading around at the charity gala last night, is completely worthless. Over the last 3 years, Carolyn quietly took out massive, toxic corporate loans under the company name, using Cameron's forged financial projections as collateral. She completely restructured the corporate legal framework in the shadows. She arranged it so that whoever held the controlling shares of Montgomery Logistics upon her death would become personally, legally, and criminally liable for all corporate debts. Carson paused, letting the silence stretch in my dark apartment, before delivering the final devastating blow. Cameron is not the legal owner of a $30 million empire, Douglas. He is the sole liable party for $45 million in hidden toxic corporate debt. The company is completely insolvent. It is a sinking ship, burning from the inside out, and your wife just legally handcuffed your son directly to the steering wheel. He did not inherit a legacy. He inherited a financial death sentence. The phone slipped right out of my trembling fingers and dropped heavily onto the worn carpet. I stared down at the glowing screen, my breath catching painfully in my chest. The sheer magnitude of what Caroline had done was terrifying and beautiful all at once. She had not been a helpless victim in her final days. She had been a master architect. She knew Cameron's boundless greed was his ultimate weakness, and she had fed him enough rope to hang himself 10 times over. He thought he was outsmarting an old dying woman. In reality, she had spent her final years digging a grave so deep he would never be able to climb out of it. I dropped to my knees on the cold floor and picked the phone back up, pressing it desperately to my ear. My voice was completely hoarse when I finally spoke. I asked Carson what was supposed to happen to me. If the company was completely bankrupt and burning to the ground, what was I supposed to do? I reminded him that I was living in a slum with $30 in my pocket and frozen bank accounts. I had absolutely nothing left to survive on. Carson sighed, a sound of deep, profound satisfaction. He told me that Caroline would never leave the man she loved without a shield. He explained that before she poisoned the corporate well, she engaged in a massive legal separation of assets. Over the last 4 years, she quietly liquidated her private stock portfolios, her personal foreign investments, and sold the licensing rights to the original logistical software patents I had written in the 80s. She legally divorced the clean assets from the dirty company. She took every single penny of the real actual wealth and placed it into a highly secure, offshore blind trust. A trust that was completely immune to domestic bankruptcy courts, corporate auditors, or any civil lawsuits Cameron might try to file. And because you are the sole named beneficiary of that trust, Carson explained, his voice filling with a sharp, victorious energy, it legally unlocked the absolute second the clock struck midnight on your 70th birthday. The company is a rotting corpse, Douglas, but the real wealth is sitting untouched, waiting for you. There is over $70 million in clean liquid capital sitting in an account that only this specific phone can access. Carson told me to stand up and put my coat back on. He said he had a private armored car waiting outside my apartment building at this very moment. He told me to pack whatever I needed because I would never be returning to this miserable room again. We had a massive amount of work to do before the local banks opened in the morning. Cameron had just initiated a hostile corporate takeover using toxic collateral, and we were going to make absolutely sure the federal auditors found exactly what they needed to drop the guillotine. I stood up in the dark, my joints no longer aching, my exhaustion completely replaced by a surging electric adrenaline. The mourning period was officially over. It was time to play the game my wife had designed for me. I did not pack a bag. I had absolutely nothing in that miserable room worth taking with me into my new life. I simply put my heavy wool coat back on over my old suit and walked out the door. I left the apartment key sitting on the rickety kitchen table and walked down the 3 flights of stairs for the very last time. When I pushed open the front doors of the dilapidated building, the freezing winter air hit my face, but I felt completely numb to it. Parked directly at the curb, idling quietly in the dark, was a massive black armored sport utility vehicle. The rear door was already open. A man in a dark suit stood silently beside it, gesturing for me to get inside. I climbed into the back seat, and the heavy door slammed shut behind me, sealing me inside a quiet, climate-controlled world. The driver did not speak a single word to me. We drove through the empty city streets, moving rapidly away from the decaying neighborhoods and heading straight toward the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. I sat in the soft leather seat, holding the black smartphone tightly in my lap. The screen was dark now, but it felt incredibly heavy in my hands, as if the device itself contained the sheer density of a dying star. We pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a massive, unmarked steel and glass building. The driver escorted me to a private elevator that required a biometric fingerprint scan to operate. The heavy steel doors slid shut, and we ascended rapidly to the top floor. The elevator opened directly into a sprawling, immaculate office. The walls were entirely made of reinforced glass, offering a panoramic view of the sleeping city below. Standing behind a massive polished stone desk was Philip Carson. He looked exactly how he sounded on the phone. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s, with sharp, calculating eyes and a demeanor of absolute authority. He did not offer empty pleasantries or a sympathetic smile. He simply walked around the desk, extended his hand, and told me it was an honor to finally meet the man Caroline had spoken of so highly. I shook his hand, feeling the firm, confident grip of a man who dismantled corporate empires for a living. He asked me for the phone. I handed the black device over to him. He walked back to his desk and connected the smartphone to a secure encrypted terminal using a specialized cable. He typed a rapid sequence of commands into his computer. The massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall behind his desk suddenly blinked to life. A loading bar appeared on the screen, and Carson explained that the phone I had been holding was not just a communication device. It was a localized decryption key. The moment it unlocked on my birthday, it automatically established a secure digital handshake with his private servers in Switzerland. The screen flashed green, and suddenly hundreds of digital folders, audio files, and scanned documents flooded the monitor. Carson clicked on the first folder. He told me to brace myself because what I was about to see was going to be incredibly difficult to stomach. He opened a video file. The security footage was incredibly crisp and clear. It was a hidden camera feed from the kitchen of my own home. The timestamp in the corner showed it was recorded exactly 3 years ago during the very first month Caroline started her intensive chemotherapy treatments. I watched my son Cameron sit at the kitchen island drinking a beer while his wife Valerie leaned over his shoulder. They were looking at a laptop screen. I heard their voices clearly through the office speakers. Valerie was laughing, pointing at the screen, and telling Cameron that if they funneled another $500,000 through the phantom vendor account, they could afford to buy the vacation home in Aspen by Christmas. Cameron laughed with her, kissing her hand, and saying the old lady was too sick to ever check the quarterly audit reports anyway. I stood completely frozen in the quiet office watching the two people I had welcomed into my home casually steal the blood and sweat of my dying wife. The sheer cruelty of their casual conversation made my stomach turn. Carson clicked on another file. It was an audio recording of a phone call between Cameron and a corrupt regional bank manager. Cameron was explicitly bribing the man to approve a massive unsecured corporate loan using forged revenue projections. Then Carson brought up a dizzying array of international routing numbers, bank statements, and offshore trust deeds. He pointed to the screen and explained that every single stolen dollar, every illegal wire transfer, and every forged signature had been meticulously tracked and recorded by his firm. They had built an airtight criminal case against my son over 3 agonizing years. The evidence was so overwhelming and undeniable that federal prosecutors would not even need to deliberate. They would simply lock Cameron away for decades. But Carson told me the criminal evidence was only the first half of my wife's brilliant design. He closed the surveillance files and opened a single isolated document. It was a digital certificate of deposit for a blind trust established in the Cayman Islands. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with intense professional admiration. He told me that Carolyn knew the company was terminally infected the moment Cameron started stealing. She knew he would eventually bleed the operating budget entirely dry. So instead of trying to save the rotting company, she initiated a massive covert extraction of the real wealth. She leveraged her original patents, her personal stock portfolios, and the entirely clean assets we had built decades ago. She quietly sold them off over 4 years, masking the transactions through a complex labyrinth of international shell companies that Cameron was far too arrogant to ever discover. She took all of that clean, liquid capital and placed it into this blind trust, Carson explained, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He highlighted the bottom line of the document. The final balance was staggering. It was $72 million. Carson explained that the trust was legally ironclad. It was completely divorced from the logistics company. It was completely immune to the massive debt Cameron was currently accumulating. The trust was designed with a single unchangeable condition. It would only unlock and transfer absolute control to me the exact moment I turned 70 years old. Cameron had inherited a hollow, empty shell of a company loaded with $45 million in toxic corporate debt. I had inherited the actual empire. I walked slowly toward the glass window, looking out over the city lights below. The sheer weight of the familial betrayal was still heavy in my chest, but it was rapidly being consumed by a new, powerful sense of purpose. I was no longer a helpless, evicted old man living in a slum. I was standing in a high-tech command center with unlimited financial resources and the absolute power to crush the people who had tried to destroy me. I turned back to Carson and asked him what our next move was. I told him Cameron was currently trying to finalize a massive $40 million acquisition of a regional competitor. I explained that Cameron was using the employee pension funds as collateral to secure the bridge loans for the buyout. Carson smiled a cold, terrifying smile. He walked over to a small cabinet and poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch, handing one to me. He said he was acutely aware of Cameron's desperate acquisition plan. He explained that Cameron was over-leveraged, completely out of cash, and desperately needed this new company to hide his massive financial holes. But Carson told me we were not going to stop the acquisition from happening. We were going to hijack it. He proposed that we take a portion of my newly unlocked $70 million and quietly approach the owners of the competitor Cameron was trying to buy. We would secretly purchase all of their outstanding corporate debt before the sun even came up. I took a slow sip of the burning scotch, letting the brilliant ruthlessness of the plan wash over me. By purchasing that corporate debt, I would instantly become my son's largest and most powerful creditor. He would be completely trapped. When his fraudulent bank loans inevitably failed, I would be the one holding the legal right to foreclose on his entire life. The silent correction had officially begun. I told Carson to execute the purchase immediately. The sun had not even begun to rise over the city when the massive international wire transfers were initiated. There was absolutely no hesitation left in my heart. The time for gentle fatherly forgiveness had died the exact moment I watched that security video of Cameron laughing at his dying mother. I sat in the plush leather chair of Carson's office, drinking the smooth scotch and watching the glowing financial monitors as millions of dollars moved silently across the globe. We were targeting the holding company that owned the debt of North Star Transport. That was the exact regional competitor my son was so desperately trying to acquire to save his sinking ship. Carson made a series of highly encrypted phone calls to private bankers in London and Tokyo. He spoke in rapid, precise terms, negotiating the aggressive buyout of North Star's commercial bonds. Because the competitor was also struggling financially, their debt was available for immediate purchase at a slight premium. I authorized the release of $35 million from my newly unlocked offshore blind trust. The sheer financial power at my fingertips was intoxicating. It took less than 3 hours to finalize the entire operation. By the time the morning traffic began to clog the wet city streets below us, the transaction was absolutely complete. The digital ink was dry. I stood up and walked over to the massive glass window, watching the city wake up beneath the gray winter clouds. Somewhere down there in my stolen mansion, Cameron was probably putting on another expensive, tailored suit, getting ready to play the role of the brilliant visionary executive. He had absolutely no idea that the solid ground beneath his feet had completely vanished. He was about to sign a hostile takeover agreement, assuming he would inherit North Star's clean assets to secretly bridge his own massive financial holes. He did not know that I now personally owned every single dollar of North Star's outstanding corporate liabilities. When Cameron finalized the purchase, his company would legally absorb all of that debt. And when his fraudulent bank loans inevitably failed because he had used protected employee pensions as illegal collateral, that massive debt would instantly default directly to me. I was now legally his absolute biggest creditor. I owned the invisible financial chains around his neck, and he did not even know they were there. Carson walked over and handed me a thick black leather folder containing the finalized transfer deeds. He asked if I wanted to have his elite legal team serve Cameron with the ownership notices right now. He said we could walk into the corporate headquarters before lunch with federal marshals and shut the entire building down. I ran my hand over the smooth leather of the folder and shook my head slowly. I told Carson that giving Cameron a quick corporate execution was far too merciful. He had humiliated me in front of 500 powerful industry leaders at the charity gala. He had thrown me out of my own home and handed me a tiny severance check, like I was a worthless, discarded employee. He had smiled while his wife ordered movers to box up my life. I wanted him to feel the exact same sheer terror and public humiliation he had so casually inflicted upon me. I told Carson we were going to embrace absolute silence. We were not going to say a single word or file a single public motion yet. We were going to let my arrogant son finalize his fraudulent acquisition. We were going to let him celebrate his fake victory and spend money he did not actually have. Carson smiled, a tight expression filled with dark, professional understanding. He reached into his desk drawer and handed me a sleek, heavy black metal credit card, tied directly to my new offshore accounts. He told me to get out of that terrible apartment immediately. He had already booked me the penthouse suite at the most exclusive luxury hotel in the financial district under a secure corporate pseudonym. I left the secure office and took the armored vehicle back to the slums one last time. I walked up the 3 steep flights of stairs to the cramped freezing room. I did not take the cheap cardboard boxes of clothes. I did not take the stale groceries I had purchased with the last of my pawnshop money. I simply picked up the small framed photograph of Caroline sitting on the nightstand and slipped it into my coat pocket. I walked right back out the door, leaving the apartment key on the rickety kitchen table. I did not look back. By noon, I was standing in a massive heated marble shower overlooking the city skyline, washing the grime and the helpless despair of the last 2 weeks completely off my skin. For the next 3 days, I remained completely invisible. I did not call Cameron. I did not visit the corporate offices. I simply sat in my quiet luxury suite wearing a plush robe, eating expensive room service, and reviewing the continuous stream of financial surveillance Carson was feeding directly to my unlocked phone. I watched in real time as Cameron frantically finalized the North Star acquisition paperwork. He was moving at breakneck speed, entirely unaware that he was walking straight into a massive steel trap. The silence was my absolute greatest weapon. Cameron completely mistook my absence for total defeat. He assumed that his cruel threat in the lobby had worked perfectly. He truly believed I had simply crawled under a rock to quietly live out my remaining years on tiny government checks exactly as he had planned. His monumental arrogance blinded him to the silent correction happening right beneath his feet. On the afternoon of the 4th day, my phone buzzed on the glass coffee table. It was an urgent, secure message from Carson, containing a digital invitation he had intercepted from Valerie's email account. Cameron and Valerie were throwing a massive, lavish party at the estate that very weekend to celebrate the successful closing of the North Star buyout. They were bringing in private celebrity chefs, opening my oldest bottles of vintage wine, and inviting the entire regional corporate elite to toast his fabricated genius. I stared at the elegant digital invitation glowing brightly on the screen. The trap was now perfectly primed. The invisible noose was securely around his neck. It was finally time for me to go home and attend a party. The weekend arrived with a heavy blanket of unseasonable snow covering the city, but the freezing temperatures did nothing to stop the massive celebration at my former home. I drove a rented sedan up the winding familiar road toward the sprawling estate Caroline and I had purchased 30 years ago. Long before I even reached the main wrought iron gates, I could see the brilliant beams of rented spotlights cutting through the falling snow and illuminating the dark winter sky. The sheer scale of the extravagance was absolutely sickening. A line of luxury vehicles stretched half a mile down the private road, waiting to be processed by a small army of valet drivers wearing crisp white uniforms. I did not pull into the main driveway. I parked my rented car on a quiet residential side street a mile away and walked the rest of the distance through the cold night air, letting the biting winter wind sharpen my ultimate focus. I reached the tall stone perimeter wall that surrounded the property. Because I had lived there for decades, I knew exactly where the security cameras were positioned, and I knew the blind spots along the southern edge of the gardens. I slipped through a side gate that the catering crews had carelessly left propped open to carry in massive trays of food and heavy crates of expensive liquor. I blended in perfectly with the chaotic rush of waiters and event staff moving quickly toward the back entrances of the massive house. I was wearing a simple dark suit and a long black overcoat that allowed me to easily disappear into the shadows of the manicured hedges. I walked up the stone steps of the back patio and stepped through the open glass doors directly into my own stolen home. The interior of the house had been completely transformed in just a matter of weeks, and the sheer visual assault of the new renovations made my chest tight with a mixture of grief and profound anger. Valerie had wasted absolutely no time eradicating every single trace of my wife. The warm antique hardwood floors that Caroline had spent months selecting had been violently torn up and replaced with cold, harsh slabs of imported white marble. The elegant, understated furniture we had collected over a lifetime of travel was entirely gone. In its place were aggressive modern pieces made of sharp glass and heavy chrome that made the living spaces feel like the lobby of a soulless corporate bank. The house was absolutely packed with hundreds of wealthy guests. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfumes, designer colognes, and the rich aroma of gourmet food being prepared in the kitchen. A string quartet played lively music in the corner of the grand foyer, but the music was nearly drowned out by the loud, arrogant laughter of the local corporate elite. I moved slowly and deliberately through the crowded rooms, keeping my head down and my face partially obscured by the high collar of my coat. I did not come here to cause a scene. I did not come here to scream at my son or to throw a drink in his face. I was here on a highly specific mission of absolute destruction. I reached into the inner pocket of my overcoat and pulled out the black smartphone my wife had left me. The device was securely linked directly to the massive federal evidence file Philip Carson was currently building on his private servers in Switzerland. I held the phone casually at my side, pretending to check a text message while I activated the high-resolution camera. I walked into the massive, completely gutted kitchen and pointed the lens at the towering new industrial refrigerators, the imported French ovens, and the solid slab of rare granite that now served as the center island. I tapped the screen. The camera took the photograph in complete silence. A tiny green checkmark appeared in the corner of the screen, confirming that the image had been instantly encrypted and uploaded to Carson. I continued my silent, slow walk through the lower levels of the estate, documenting every single grotesque display of stolen wealth. I took clear photographs of the massive new crystal chandeliers hanging in the dining room. I photographed the expensive modern art pieces Valerie had haphazardly nailed to the freshly painted walls. I even walked into the private study and took a picture of the brand new custom-built mahogany wet bar Cameron had installed perfectly over the exact spot where Caroline used to keep her antique writing desk. With every single photograph I took, I felt the invisible steel trap closing tighter and tighter around my arrogant son. I knew exactly how Cameron and Valerie were paying for these massive, lavish renovations. Philip Carson had shown me the deeply buried financial routing numbers just 2 days ago. Cameron did not have the liquid cash to afford $1 million home renovation. He was bridging the massive financial gap by taking out completely illegal unsecured personal loans using Montgomery Logistics as his direct collateral. He was physically bleeding the corporate operating budget dry to pay the contractors, the interior designers, and the celebrity chefs catering this very party. Every piece of marble, every crystal glass, and every expensive hors d'oeuvre being passed around this room was paid for with stolen money. I slowly made my way up the grand curving staircase, blending in with a group of wealthy guests who were giving themselves a self-guided tour of the second floor. I broke away from the group and walked silently down the long hallway toward the master suite. The heavy oak doors were wide open, showcasing Valerie's crowning achievement of total disrespect. The vintage ceramic tiles that Caroline had loved so much were completely gone. The entire master bathroom had been expanded and covered in gaudy gold fixtures and ridiculous oversized soaking tubs. I stood in the doorway and took 5 rapid photographs capturing the extensive plumbing and structural changes that would have easily cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to execute. I felt a brief sharp pang of sorrow for the memories that had been violently scraped away from these walls, but I quickly buried that sadness under a mountain of cold, calculated resolve. This house was no longer a home. It was simply a massive, beautiful piece of criminal evidence. I walked back down the stairs and moved toward the main ballroom, where the largest crowd of guests had gathered. I stood in the deep shadows near the heavy velvet curtains and finally laid eyes on my son. Cameron was standing on a slightly raised platform near the roaring fireplace holding a crystal glass of champagne. Valerie stood right beside him, wearing a stunning emerald green gown and a diamond necklace that caught the bright light of the chandeliers. They were completely surrounded by a circle of fawning regional investors and desperate corporate sycophants. Cameron was holding court, speaking loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear his arrogant boasting. He was enthusiastically telling the captivated crowd about his absolute brilliant success in finalizing the acquisition of North Star Transport. He bragged about how he had outmaneuvered the entire regional market, sweeping in and securing the buyout when no one else had the corporate vision or the aggressive capital to do it. He claimed this massive expansion was going to completely dominate the global logistics market for the next 50 years. He raised his glass to the cheering crowd, drinking to his own fabricated genius and his limitless future. I stood in the shadows and watched him drink the champagne. The sheer irony of the moment was so incredibly thick, I could practically taste it in the air. He was throwing the party of the century to celebrate buying a company that was currently drowning in debt. And he had absolutely no idea that his own father, the old man he had thrown onto the street with $30 in his pocket, was the sole owner of every single penny of that exact debt. He was celebrating his own financial execution. He was spending illegal monies to impress people who would abandon him the absolute second the federal agents kicked down the doors of his corporate office. Valerie laughed loudly at a joke one of the investors made, leaning into Cameron and kissing him on the cheek. She looked incredibly smug, staring out over the crowd of wealthy people as if she were a queen surveying her loyal subjects. She caught sight of herself in a massive antique mirror hanging on the far wall and paused to admire her expensive diamond necklace. I calmly raised the black smartphone one last time and zoomed the camera lens directly onto her smiling face and the stolen diamonds resting on her chest. I captured the photograph, freezing their false victory perfectly in time. The file synced to the secure server thousands of miles away, instantly joining the mountain of irrefutable evidence that would soon destroy their entire lives. I did not need to stay a single minute longer. I had seen everything I needed to see, and I had gathered all the visual proof Carson required to finalize the federal indictments. I turned around quietly and walked back through the crowded ballroom, navigating through the sea of expensive suits and glittering gowns. No one noticed the old man in the dark overcoat slipping silently out the back glass doors. No one saw me walk down the stone steps and disappear completely into the freezing winter night. I walked the long mile back down the dark residential street toward my rented car with the heavy snow falling steadily around me. I felt incredibly light. The heavy, crushing burden of victimhood had been completely lifted from my shoulders. Cameron and Valerie were currently dancing on a stage made of rotting wood and stolen money, and they were completely blind to the massive fire burning directly beneath their feet. I unlocked my car and sat in the cold driver's seat, pulling out the locked phone. I sent a single short text message to Philip Carson, simply stating that the visual documentation was complete and the targets were entirely unaware. Carson replied less than 10 seconds later. His message was brief and carried the exact, precise weight of a falling guillotine. He told me the federal auditors were fully briefed and the trap was completely set. The false victory was over. The absolute reckoning was about to begin. I woke up on Monday morning feeling a profound sense of calm that I had not experienced in over 5 years. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling window of my penthouse suite, drinking a cup of dark, roasted coffee and watching the winter sun rise over the frozen city. Today was the day the grand illusion finally shattered. Down in the financial district, my son was walking into the massive glass conference room of his corporate bank. Thanks to the secure digital surveillance Philip Carson had established, I did not need to be in the room to watch the execution. I had my black smartphone propped up against my coffee cup, streaming the audio feed directly from the microphone of Cameron's own laptop. I listened as he confidently greeted the senior bank executives. His voice was dripping with that same unbearable arrogance he had displayed at the party just 2 nights ago. He joked about the heavy snow slowing down traffic and asked the loan officer if the final wire transfer for the North Star acquisition was ready for his signature. He sounded like a man who believed he was completely invincible, standing at the absolute peak of the world. But the loan officer did not laugh at his jokes. The room grew completely silent. I heard the rustle of heavy paper folders being opened and the sharp slide of documents across a polished wooden table. The senior underwriter cleared his throat and told Cameron that there was a massive critical problem with the final loan approval. He explained that during the mandatory 48-hour closing audit, their risk management software had flagged several severe discrepancies in the corporate collateral. Cameron scoffed loudly, dismissing the concern with a wave of his hand. He arrogantly reminded the bankers that he had put up the entire employee pension fund and the physical logistics fleet as an ironclad guarantee. He told them his company was worth $30 million and demanded they push the paperwork through immediately so he could get back to running his empire. The underwriter's voice remained ice cold and entirely professional. He told Cameron that the physical fleet was already massively over-leveraged by 3 hidden corporate loans taken out years ago. He then dropped the ultimate bomb. He stated that the holding company owning the debt of North Star Transport had suddenly changed hands over the weekend. A private offshore entity had purchased all of the outstanding liabilities entirely in cash. Because of this aggressive sudden change in the debt structure, the bank risk assessment algorithm had completely rejected the bridge loan. They could not legally release the $40 million. The acquisition was completely dead in the water. I sat in my quiet hotel room listening to the sheer panic finally crack my son's perfect facade. Cameron began to shout. He slammed his fist hard on the conference table and threatened to sue the entire bank for breach of faith. He told them he had already signed legally binding preliminary agreements with North Star. He had already spent millions of dollars in non-refundable legal fees and corporate deposits using the daily operating capital of Montgomery Logistics. If this massive loan did not clear today, he would be entirely out of cash by Friday afternoon. The bank executives remained completely unmoved by his outburst. They politely asked him to leave the building and informed him that due to the flagged financial discrepancies, they were legally required to freeze his current corporate credit lines, pending a full internal review by federal regulators. Cameron stumbled out of the bank. I could hear his rapid, heavy breathing through the phone microphone as he practically ran down the sidewalk to his parked car. He got inside and slammed the door, shutting out the noise of the city traffic. He called Valerie immediately. His voice was completely unrecognizable. It was high-pitched and trembling with pure, raw terror. He told her the bank had pulled the plug on the entire deal. He confessed that he had secretly drained the company accounts to pay for the lavish party, the extravagant house renovations, and the massive legal fees required to secure the buyout. He told her the payroll checks for 800 employees were going to bounce at the end of the week. He explained frantically that if that happened, the Federal Labor Board would immediately step in to audit the ledgers and the entire house of cards would collapse in a matter of days. He told her they needed liquid cash right now to cover the massive immediate shortfall. He ordered her to call her elite real estate agent and put the estate on the market for an immediate cash sale. He said they would sell it at a 20% loss to a corporate buyer if they had to, just to get the cash into their accounts before Friday morning. I smiled, taking another slow sip of my warm coffee. I leaned back in my plush chair and waited for the second half of my wife's brilliant trap to snap shut. Valerie was a woman of swift, ruthless action when her own personal luxury was threatened. She immediately called her high-end real estate broker. She explained that they needed an emergency cash buyer for the estate and were willing to bypass standard inspections to close the deal within 3 days. The broker was thrilled at the prospect of the massive commission and promised to pull the property deed right away to expedite the legal listing. For the next 3 hours, the audio feed was completely silent as I waited patiently in my suite. Just after lunch, my phone buzzed with a new intercepted call. It was Valerie calling Cameron back. She was crying uncontrollably. It was not the delicate, calculated crying she used to manipulate people at social events. It was the ugly, hysterical sobbing of a woman who had just looked over the edge of a massive cliff and realized she was falling. Cameron answered the phone, barking at her, asking if the house was officially listed on the private market. Valerie could barely catch her breath to speak. She told him the broker had called her back in an absolute panic. The broker could not list the property. The house could not be sold, leveraged, or transferred to any buyer under any circumstances. Cameron screamed into the phone, demanding to know why she was failing at such a simple task. Valerie choked on her own tears as she explained the legal nightmare she had just discovered in the public records. She said that when Carolyn transferred the deed into her own name right before she died, she had secretly attached a massive, impenetrable digital lien to the entire property. It was an ironclad financial hold placed by a highly secure foreign trust. The lien stipulated that the property could never be sold, altered, or borrowed against without the direct digital authorization of the trust beneficiary. Cameron demanded to know who the beneficiary of the trust was, assuming it was some hidden corporate entity he could sue or bribe. Valerie sobbed louder and told him the terrifying truth. The lien could only be released by a specific encrypted digital key, and that key was permanently locked inside the black smartphone Caroline had left to his father. The silence on the phone line was absolutely glorious. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total defeat. I could practically hear the gears in Cameron's head grinding to a violent halt as the devastating reality of his situation washed over him. He had spent millions of dollars renovating a house he could not legally sell. He had stolen a company that was drowning in massive debt he could not pay. Every single exit door he tried to open was already deadbolted from the outside by his dead mother. And the only person in the entire world holding the keys to his salvation was the father he had thrown out into the freezing street with nothing but a tiny severance check and a mocking laugh. Cameron whispered my name into the phone. His voice was entirely hollow, completely devoid of the arrogant poison that had defined his entire adult life. He told Valerie they were going to lose absolutely everything. They were going to lose the luxury cars, the massive house, the logistics company, and their very freedom. He realized in that exact moment that his mother had played him perfectly. She had handed him the shiny crown he so desperately wanted, knowing full well it was laced with deadly poison. He hung up the phone without another word. I sat in my warm, quiet suite looking out at the beautiful city and felt absolute, perfect peace. The financial chokehold was entirely complete. My son was now a prisoner in his own stolen castle, desperately waiting for the walls to crush him. He had no money, no credit, and no way out. All he could do now was wait for the final blow to fall, and I was more than ready to deliver it. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in watching a man slowly drown in a prison of his own making. I did not leave my hotel suite. I simply sat by the massive glass window watching the digital monitors Philip Carson had provided me. The live financial feeds showed the absolute desperate chaos unfolding inside the walls of Montgomery Logistics. Cameron was completely out of viable options. The corporate credit lines remained entirely frozen by the banking syndicate. The massive payroll for 800 dedicated employees was scheduled to process early Friday morning, and the primary operating accounts were essentially empty. If those weekly checks bounced, The State Labor Board would immediately launch a full-scale aggressive audit into the company ledgers. A state audit would instantly expose the millions of dollars Cameron and Valerie had embezzled over the last 3 years to fund their lavish lifestyle. They were entirely cornered. They could not sell the estate to raise emergency capital because of Caroline's ironclad digital lien. They could not borrow another single dime from any legitimate financial institution in the city. The walls were closing in, and my son was rapidly running out of oxygen. I thought about the sheer, terrifying brilliance of my late wife. Caroline had predicted this exact scenario years ago. She knew that when a greedy man is pushed to the absolute brink of financial ruin, he will not suddenly develop a moral compass. He will simply look for the largest pile of unguarded money he can find. She knew Cameron would eventually set his sights on the employee pension fund. That was why she had hired Philip Carson in the first place, to build an invisible fortress around the life savings of our people. On Thursday afternoon, my encrypted phone buzzed loudly on the glass coffee table. It was an urgent notification from Carson. I answered the call immediately, and Carson instructed me to look at the live, secure feed of the primary company pension account. I opened the application on my tablet and stared at the screen. The massive employee retirement fund was currently showing a pending total withdrawal status. This was the exact same fund Cameron had illegally tried to use as collateral for his failed corporate acquisition just a few days ago. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I asked Carson what exactly I was looking at. Carson explained that Cameron had just crossed the absolute final line of no return. Out of sheer panic and a desperate manic need for immediate liquid cash to cover the Friday payroll and hide his massive embezzlement, Cameron was attempting to completely cash out the entire employee pension fund. The sheer audacity of the move made me physically sick to my stomach. He was trying to drain the life savings of the truck drivers, the warehouse workers, and the mechanics who had built this company with their bare hands. These were people I knew personally. These were families I had promised to protect. I remembered an older mechanic who had worked for us since the very first year we opened our doors. I remembered the single mothers driving our local delivery routes, relying on that pension to send their children to college. Cameron was willing to destroy all of those innocent lives just to save his own skin for a few more weeks. But there was a massive structural problem with his desperate plan, and my son knew it better than anyone. While he was the current chief executive officer, the foundational legal bylaws of the pension trust strictly required 2 authorized signatures to initiate a total liquidation. One signature belonged to the acting executive. The second signature had to come from the original founding trustee of the company. That founding trustee was me. I asked Carson how Cameron could possibly initiate the massive withdrawal without my physical signature on the authorization paperwork. Carson let out a low, dark laugh that carried absolutely no humor. He told me that my son was currently sitting in his corner executive office, completely alone, committing the ultimate corporate sin. Using the hidden surveillance software Carson had embedded in the company network, we could see exactly what Cameron was doing on his desktop computer. Cameron had taken an old human resources document with my genuine signature on it. He had scanned it into his computer and was actively using digital editing software to fraudulently superimpose my signature onto the massive pension liquidation order. He was actively committing forgery right before our digital eyes. I watched the green progress bar on my tablet screen slowly filling up as Cameron prepared to submit the forged documents to the Federal Financial Clearinghouse. The tension in my hotel suite was absolutely suffocating. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to tell Carson to stop the transfer immediately. I was terrified that Cameron might actually succeed and wipe out the retirement accounts of all those hard-working, innocent people. But Carson anticipated my panic before I even spoke a word. He calmly assured me that the workers and their families were entirely safe. He explained that months ago he had secretly set up a highly sophisticated digital shadow firewall completely surrounding the pension fund. The moment Cameron hit the final submit button, the money would not actually leave the secure banking account. Instead, the fraudulent transaction would be permanently captured, frozen, and routed directly into a secure federal evidence locker that Carson controlled. Carson told me to watch the tablet screen very closely. I held my breath as the green progress bar finally reached 100%. For a fraction of a second, the screen went completely blank. Then a bright red error message flashed aggressively across the tablet, indicating that the massive wire transfer had been flagged, intercepted, and completely halted. Cameron had pulled the trigger, but the gun had exploded directly in his hands. Carson spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon completing a fatal operation. He told me the trap was now perfectly primed and permanently locked. He explained the absolute gravity of what my son had just done. By intentionally forging my signature on a highly regulated financial document and attempting to electronically transfer tens of millions of protected retirement dollars across state lines, Cameron had just elevated this entire situation from a messy civil family dispute into a massive federal crime. He had not just stolen money from his mother. He had just committed aggravated wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and a direct, severe violation of federal labor protection laws in a single desperate keystroke. The penalty for these specific federal crimes was not a simple corporate fine or a gentle slap on the wrist. Carson explained that the federal government does not forgive the theft of working-class pensions. The penalty was decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Cameron thought he was being a brilliant, ruthless executive buying himself a few more days to fix his broken empire. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed us the exact rope we needed to hang him publicly. I sat in the quiet luxury of my penthouse suite listening to Carson outline the final steps of our strategy. There was no more waiting. There was no more hiding in the shadows. Cameron had committed a major federal felony using my forged signature, and it was time to bring the full, devastating weight of the law crashing down upon his arrogant head. Carson told me he was currently transmitting the captured fraudulent wire transfer data directly to his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Labor. The financial chokehold was entirely complete. My son had completely destroyed himself, just as Caroline had predicted he would. I thanked Carson for his flawless execution and ended the call. I walked over to the closet and pulled out the sharpest, darkest suit I owned. The final execution was scheduled for tomorrow morning in the corporate boardroom, and I was going to be the one holding the axe. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 in the morning on Friday. I arrived at the Montgomery Logistics headquarters at exactly 7:45. The winter morning was bitterly cold, but I did not feel the chill. I wore a tailored charcoal suit that I had purchased the day before. It fit me perfectly. I stood in the marble lobby, not hiding in the shadows this time, but standing directly in the center of the room. Philip Carson stood to my right, carrying a thick leather briefcase. To my left stood 2 men in identical dark blue suits. They did not carry briefcases. They carried the quiet, terrifying authority of the federal government. They were senior forensic auditors from the Department of Labor and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We did not speak. We simply waited for the clock to strike 8. Upstairs on the top floor, my son was fighting for his life. Through the encrypted audio feed Carson had tapped into, we listened to Cameron pacing at the head of the massive mahogany conference table. The room was filled with the 10 senior board members of the company. These were men and women who had trusted Caroline and me for decades. Now they were listening to my son spin a frantic web of desperate lies. Cameron was sweating. His voice was pitched high and tight. He was telling the board that a temporary banking glitch had frozen their operating accounts, and that to meet the massive Friday payroll they needed to authorize an immediate emergency manual override of the employee pension fund. He promised them it was only a 48-hour loan to cover the weekend. He lied with the practiced ease of a career criminal, telling them the North Star acquisition was still moving forward and would double their stock value by Monday morning. The board members sounded hesitant. An older woman named Margaret, who had been our chief financial officer 15 years ago, asked Cameron why the automated system had completely rejected his digital transfer the day before. Cameron stammered. He blamed a software error. He begged them to sign the manual authorization papers he was passing around the table. He told them if they did not sign immediately, the employees would not get paid, and the company would face a devastating state audit. At exactly 8 o'clock, I stepped onto the executive elevator. Carson and the 2 federal agents stepped in beside me. We rode up in absolute silence. When the steel doors slid open on the top floor, the executive assistant sitting at the front desk stood up in shock to stop us, but the federal agents simply flashed their gold badges. She sank back down into her chair, completely pale. I walked straight down the plush-carpeted hallway toward the heavy oak doors of the main boardroom. I did not knock. I simply pushed both doors open with a loud, heavy thud that echoed through the entire room. Every single head at the massive mahogany table snapped toward the doorway. Cameron was standing at the head of the table holding a gold pen out to Margaret. When he saw me standing there, his face completely drained of color. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost rise from the grave. He dropped his arm, and the gold pen clattered loudly onto the polished wood. For a long moment, the entire room was dead silent. Margaret stood up from her chair. She looked at my sharp suit and the 3 imposing men flanking me. She whispered my name in absolute shock. Cameron finally found his voice. It was a weak, trembling sound. He demanded to know what I was doing here. He pointed a shaking finger at me and ordered the board members to call building security to have me forcibly removed. He screamed that I was a bitter old man trying to ruin the company. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream. I walked slowly and deliberately to the front of the room. The board members instinctively pulled their chairs back to give me space. I looked directly at Cameron. I told him he was not going to call security because he no longer had the authority to give orders in this building. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the black smartphone. I walked over to the digital presentation podium at the front of the room. I took the connection cable resting on the podium and plugged it directly into the bottom of the phone. The massive digital projector screen covering the entire back wall of the boardroom instantly buzzed to life. The company logo disappeared. In its place, a highly organized, encrypted digital dashboard appeared. Carson stepped forward and introduced himself to the board. He then introduced the 2 men standing by the doors as federal agents. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Margaret put her hand over her mouth. Cameron took a sudden step backward, bumping hard into the glass window behind him. I looked at the terrified board members and told them they were about to sign a document that would send every single one of them to federal prison. I explained that Cameron was not asking for a temporary loan to cover a banking glitch. He was asking them to be his accomplices in a massive federal crime to cover up his own rampant embezzlement. Cameron tried to shout over me. He yelled that the presentation was completely fake and that I was insane. I simply tapped the screen of the black phone. The projector displayed the first piece of evidence. It was a massive spreadsheet detailing the offshore shell companies Cameron had secretly established 3 years ago. I walked the board members through the exact routing numbers, showing them how millions of dollars in operating capital had been systematically drained from their logistics contracts and funneled directly into accounts owned exclusively by Cameron and Valerie. I tapped the screen again. The spreadsheet was replaced by a series of high-resolution photographs. They were the pictures I had taken just a few nights ago at the mansion. The imported marble, the custom bar, the diamond necklaces. I told the board that every single piece of luxury in those photographs had been bought with stolen company money, while they were being told the profit margins were simply shrinking due to a bad economy. Margaret looked at the screen and then glared at Cameron with absolute burning disgust. She asked him if it was true. Cameron could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he stared at his entire life collapsing on a glowing screen in front of his peers. I tapped the phone a 3rd time. The screen switched to a series of intercepted text messages between Cameron and Valerie. I read them out loud so there could be no misunderstanding. I read the message where Valerie called the board members stupid old dinosaurs who would never catch on. I read the message where Cameron laughed about draining the employee healthcare fund to buy his wife a vacation home in Aspen. The room grew so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. The profound betrayal in the room was a physical weight pressing down on everyone. Then I tapped the screen for the final piece of evidence. The massive projector displayed the digital pension liquidation order Cameron had attempted to submit yesterday afternoon. I pointed directly to the second signature line. I asked Margaret to look closely at my signature. She leaned forward, putting on her reading glasses. I told her the signature was a complete digital forgery. I explained that Cameron had attempted to steal $40 million from the working-class families of this company and had committed aggravated federal wire fraud to do it. The federal agent standing by the door stepped forward and confirmed my statement loudly enough for everyone to hear. He stated that the Department of Labor had already secured the forensic digital footprint linking the forgery directly to Cameron's personal office computer. Cameron was cornered. There were no more lies he could spin. He slumped against the glass window, looking like a broken, pathetic child. He looked at me with tears streaming down his face. He begged me to stop. He said I was his father and that I could not do this to him. He pleaded with me to keep this in the family, to let him resign quietly and walk away. I looked at him feeling absolutely nothing but cold, empty pity. I told him he had forfeited the right to call me his father the day he forced his dying mother to sign away her life, and laughed at me in the lawyer's office. But the execution was not over. The criminal charges were only the first part of his punishment. It was time for the financial reckoning. I told the board that because of Cameron's massive hidden debts, the company was entirely bankrupt. I explained that the North Star acquisition had completely failed because a private entity had bought all of the outstanding debt, making the corporate loans default. Cameron looked up, his tear-streaked face twisting in utter confusion. He asked me who bought the debt. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the thick black leather folder Carson had given me. I dropped it heavily onto the mahogany table. It landed with a loud slap. I looked Cameron dead in the eye. I bought the debt, I said, my voice echoing off the walls. I used the private $70 million trust your mother spent 4 years building for me in secret. The trust she built from her own clean assets while you were busy stealing the infected ones. I am your biggest creditor, Cameron. And because you are the sole controlling shareholder who defaulted on these massive toxic loans, I have the absolute legal right to foreclose on every single asset you possess. I turned to the board members. I announced that as the primary debt holder, I was executing an immediate hostile takeover of Montgomery Logistics for pennies on the dollar. I was legally seizing the entire company back into my own name. I picked up the gold pen Cameron had dropped on the table. I signed the single piece of paper Carson placed in front of me, officially terminating Cameron as the chief executive officer for gross criminal misconduct and massive financial fraud. By terminating him for cause, I completely stripped him of his golden parachute, his severance packages, and any legal protections the company might have offered him. He was completely exposed. He was entirely bankrupt, and he was going to prison. I unplugged the black smartphone from the podium. The massive projector screen went dark. The show was officially over. I handed the black leather folder and the digital storage drives directly to the 2 federal agents. I told them they had absolute full access to the building, the corporate servers, and the financial ledgers. I asked them to do their jobs. The agents walked deliberately around the large mahogany table. They grabbed Cameron by the arms and pulled him away from the window. They did not read him his rights politely. They slammed him face first onto the polished wood table, pulling his arms behind his back. The loud metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing in the silent boardroom was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 5 years. Cameron sobbed openly, begging Margaret, begging the board, begging anyone to help him. Nobody moved. Nobody said a single word. They all watched with cold satisfaction as the parasite was finally removed from the host. The agents pulled him up to his feet and marched him toward the heavy oak doors. As they passed me, Cameron stopped struggling. He looked at me one last time, his eyes completely hollow and destroyed. He had finally realized the absolute terrifying magnitude of the trap his mother had built for him. He realized that every single thing he had done to hurt me had only given me the exact power I needed to ruin him. I did not offer him a final word of comfort. I did not say goodbye. I simply turned my back to him and looked at the board members. I told them to take a 10-minute break to collect themselves. We had a massive amount of work to do to stabilize the company payroll and reassure our employees that their pensions were entirely safe. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind my son. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly light and clean. The empire was finally mine again, and the silent correction was complete. While I was standing in the boardroom watching the federal agents secure the corporate ledgers, Philip Carson received a real-time alert on his secure tablet. The massive invisible net we had cast over my son also extended perfectly over his wife. Valerie was not waiting faithfully at the estate. The moment Cameron had called her in a blind panic the day before, she had instantly recognized the sinking ship and coldly decided to abandon it. Carson showed me the live security camera feed from the international departure terminal of the local airport. Valerie was standing at a premium airline ticket counter, wearing an oversized designer coat and carrying a single expensive leather weekend bag. She had packed whatever jewelry she could carry and was desperately trying to purchase a first-class one-way ticket to a country without an extradition treaty. I watched the silent footage as she impatiently handed the airline attendant her solid metal platinum credit card. The attendant swiped the card, looked at her monitor, and shook her head. Valerie looked visibly annoyed and slapped a second card onto the counter. Then a third, then a fourth. Every single financial account tied to her name, the joint accounts, the corporate credit lines, and her private luxury funds had been completely frozen by the federal fraud investigation, the exact moment Cameron attempted the forged wire transfer. I watched the incredibly arrogant woman who had ordered my personal belongings thrown into cheap cardboard boxes suddenly realize she did not even have enough liquid cash to buy a bottle of water. The security footage showed her face contort into an ugly mask of pure panic. She began screaming at the airline attendant, causing a massive public scene and throwing her expensive leather bag onto the floor. The tantrum did not last long. Two uniformed airport police officers approached her from behind. They firmly took her by the arms, leading her away to a private holding room to wait for the federal marshals who were already en route. She had tried to run with her pockets full of stolen money, but she was completely trapped. I left Carson to manage the transition team and walked out of the boardroom. I took the private executive elevator down to the massive marble lobby of the corporate headquarters. I wanted to be standing there when my son finally made his public exit. The lobby was entirely packed with people. News of the sudden federal raid had spread through the massive building like wildfire. Hundreds of employees, including the warehouse managers, the local truck drivers, and the administrative staff, had gathered near the security turnstiles. These were the very people Cameron had tried to financially destroy just to save himself. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a tight human corridor leading directly to the front doors. The polished steel doors of the main elevator finally slid open. The two federal agents marched Cameron out into the center of the massive room. His hands were securely cuffed behind his back, the steel chain clinking softly against his belt. The expensive tailored suit he had worn like an invincible suit of armor just hours ago now looked like a terribly ill-fitting costume. The entire lobby fell completely dead silent. There was absolutely no whispering. There was no shock or pity. There was only the heavy, crushing weight of hundreds of condemning stares. Cameron walked slowly across the polished marble floor, his head hung low in absolute disgrace. He had to walk past the older mechanic whose pension he had tried to steal. He had to walk past the single mothers he had planned to fire. The sheer gravity of his public humiliation was physically pressing him toward the floor. He stumbled slightly, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the smooth stone, but the agents pulled him roughly back to his feet. As the agents led him toward the revolving glass front doors, he stopped. He lifted his heavy head and looked directly at me, standing quietly near the main reception desk. The arrogant corporate king who had mocked me at the charity gala was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, broken little boy desperately searching for his father. He looked deeply into my eyes, waiting for a single shred of sympathy. He was waiting for the unconditional parental love he had ruthlessly exploited and weaponized against me for the last 5 years. He wanted me to step forward, to tell the federal agents there had been a terrible mistake, to wrap my warm coat around his shoulders and promise him everything would be all right, just like I had done when he was a child. He wanted me to save him from the monster he had become. I looked at his tear-stained face and felt absolutely nothing. The deep, endless well of forgiveness I had carried in my heart for him my entire life had completely dried up. I did not smile to mock his downfall. I did not frown in anger. I simply looked at him for one long, final second, acknowledging that the man standing in handcuffs was a total stranger to me now. And then I slowly turned my back to him. I heard him let out a sharp, broken, pathetic sob as the agents pushed him through the heavy glass doors and out into the freezing winter morning. The flashing red and blue lights of the waiting federal vehicles painted the lobby walls, reflecting brightly off the glass. I did not turn around to watch them push him into the back of the car. I simply walked over to the nearest security guard, told him to lock the front doors, and took a deep breath of the clean, cold air. The toxic rot had finally been removed from my family and my company. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked shut behind my son. The bitter, freezing winter that mirrored the absolute lowest point of my life has completely melted away, yielding to a bright and incredibly warm spring. I am sitting in a comfortable wooden chair on the back porch of my estate, listening to the gentle morning breeze rustle through the large oak trees. I did not simply move back into this house. After the federal government seized all of Cameron and Valerie's fraudulent assets, I purchased the property back free and clear at a federal auction, using a small fraction of the offshore trust fund. The first thing I did was hire a team of local contractors to violently rip out the cold, harsh marble and the gaudy gold fixtures Valerie had installed. The warm, antique hardwood floors have been completely restored, and the house finally feels like a home again. It breathes with a quiet, steady rhythm that brings a deep comfort to my weary bones. Down in the city, Montgomery Logistics is no longer a sinking ship. With the massive infusion of clean capital from my trust and the immediate removal of the toxic debts Cameron had accumulated, the company stabilized within a matter of weeks. The massive employee pension fund is entirely restored and legally fortified behind layers of ironclad trusts that no executive will ever be able to touch again. I kept my promise to the working families who built our legacy. When I walk the floors of the warehouse now, the employees do not look away from me in pity or discomfort. They greet me with warm, genuine smiles and a profound sense of mutual respect. The heavy, suffocating cloud of corporate greed has been completely blown away, and the air inside the building is finally clean. As for Cameron and Valerie, I have not spoken a single word to either of them since the morning the federal agents took them away in handcuffs. They are currently serving lengthy sentences in separate federal penitentiaries, convicted of massive corporate fraud and embezzlement. I feel no anger toward them anymore. I feel absolutely nothing at all. They are simply ghosts from a nightmare I have finally woken up from. I look down at my hands. Resting quietly in my palms is the black smartphone my wife left me. The device that saved my life and destroyed my enemies has sat completely dormant in my desk drawer for the last 5 months. But today felt different. Today is a beautiful, clear morning, and I finally feel strong enough to close the absolute final chapter of this long, painful story. I touch the glass screen, and the phone wakes up instantly recognizing my fingerprint. I bypass the massive folders containing the dark, heavy evidence of my son's betrayal. I do not need to look at those terrible surveillance videos or the fraudulent bank statements ever again. Instead, I open a small hidden folder tucked away at the very bottom of the screen. It is a folder Philip Carson told me about, but advised me to save until I was truly ready to move on. Inside the folder is a single video file. I tap the screen to play it. Caroline's face appears bright and clear. The video was recorded years ago, before the illness had truly begun to steal her strength. She is sitting in the garden right here at the estate, wearing her favorite yellow summer dress and smiling with a warmth that makes my chest ache in the most beautiful way. She looks directly into the camera lens, and her voice fills the quiet morning air on the porch. She tells me, "Hello, my love." She says that if I am watching this video, it means the storm has finally passed, and the brutal work she left for me is entirely finished. She apologizes softly for forcing me to walk through such a dark and terrifying fire. She tells me she knew it would break my heart to see what our son had become, but she also knew that a broken heart can heal, while a life spent in invisible chains is a life completely wasted. She leans forward, looking so incredibly alive, and tells me the game is officially over. She says I have survived the parasites and protected the people who truly mattered. Now she says, her voice thick with absolute unconditional love, it is time for me to finally rest. She tells me to stop fighting, to stop worrying about the legacy, and to just live for myself. She asks me to enjoy the sunshine, to drink good wine, and to plant the spring flowers in the garden, just the way we used to do together. She smiles one last radiant time and tells me she loves me before the screen fades to black. I sit on the porch for a long time, letting the gentle sound of the morning birds fill the silence left by her voice. A single tear rolls down my cheek, but it is not a tear of grief. It is a tear of profound, overwhelming relief. The heavy, invisible armor I have been wearing for the last 5 years slowly unbuckles and falls completely away. I look down at the bright screen of the phone. I select the massive encrypted folders containing the evidence, the surveillance, and the painful memories of the darkest period of my life. I hit the delete button, erasing them permanently from the device and from my world. I keep only the video of Caroline. I press the side button, and the screen goes completely dark. I slide the locked phone into my shirt pocket. I stand up from the wooden chair, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The sun is fully over the horizon now, casting a warm, golden light across the massive, manicured lawn. I walk slowly down the stone steps of the back patio and step onto the soft, green grass. I walk toward the large, empty garden beds waiting near the edge of the property. I pick up a small metal trowel and a wooden basket filled with bright new seeds. I kneel down in the soft, cool earth, feeling the dirt on my hands. I look up at the clear blue sky, feeling an absolute, unshakable peace settle deep into my soul. The winter is over. The house is safe. The legacy is secure. And for the very first time in a long time, I am completely ready to watch something beautiful grow. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true power never roars. Arrogance and greed will always build their own spectacular traps, completely blinding people to the quiet strength of those they continuously underestimate. My son foolishly mistook my gentle love for weakness, never realizing that the deepest waters conceal the strongest currents. Family is not defined by shared blood alone, but by absolute loyalty, respect, and unconditional care. When you destroy those sacred boundaries out of pure selfishness, the truth will always find a way to correct the balance, often through the very hands of the people you thought you had completely broken. If you believe that greed always reaps what it sows, and that true justice never sleeps, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this one.